Today's big idea. So we've officially entered the age of weaponized interdependence, where supply chains, finance, and tech networks double as pressure points. The essay opens up on a telling moment. So this past June, there was a framework deal between Washington and Beijing that wasn't triumphalism or a reset. It was a U.S. learning how it feels when others can squeeze back. In this new era, the tools aren't tanks and treaties, but sanctions, export controls, and supply chain choke points embedded in the global economy's wiring. So, as always, a bit of a disclaimer. This is a summary of the author's opinions, those authors being Henry Farrell and Abram Newman. This essay being The Weaponized World Economy, Surviving the New Age of Economic Coercion in this past Foreign Affairs, September and October 2025. So basically, what's the lesson here? So Farrell and Newman's core lesson is that globalization created hubs and choke points where places where a single actor can see flows like a panopticon of the jail, basically, or pinch them, which is a choke point. So for 2 decades, the U.S. exploited these advantages in finance, information, and advanced technology. Now others can too. That mutual vulnerability is changing behavior. What used to be a policy choice is turning into a survival strategy. So states are mapping their dependencies, building apparatuses to monitor and act, and using leverage to force concessions. So first, the June deal itself is a case study in reciprocal pressure. So according to the authors, U.S. officials agreed to ease some chip, tool, and AI chip restrictions, allowing firms like Synopsys, Cadence, and NVIDIA to resume certain sales while China loosened rare earth limits that were hobbling U.S. automakers. That quid pro quo shows how each side can press a choke point like EDA versus rare earth to get what it wants. Second, Washington's old toolkit got turbocharged. So first by Biden's expanded semiconductor controls on Russia and China, then by an attempt to blueprint who gets access to top-tier AI chips and model weights. But the paper notes that grand designs to engineers permanent tech advantage ran into political limits and a world that pushes back. Thirdly, others are learning fast. So China, stung by Snowden-era revelations and later tech controls, built capacity to spot and exploit U.S. weaknesses and is now pressuring U.S. vulnerabilities to force negotiations. The EU, meanwhile, understands the risks but vacillates because of international institutional constraints. Apparently, I can't talk this morning. Anyways, fourth, the authors argue that U.S. institutional muscle, like the maps of global finance at the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, and the semiconductor knowledge base inside the National Security Council, the NSC, has atrophied under a more personalistic style of policymaking. They describe big staff cuts, a frayed interagency process, and decisions centered on whoever last had the president's ear. That shift, they warn, sacrifices long-term national interest for short-term wins and invites legal and allied blowback. Fifth, allies and courts are starting to push back. So the SA cites a Canadian warning that the U.S. is monetizing its hegemony, and a U.S. trade court decision reining in overreach under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act signals that unconstrained coercion can boomerang. Finally, the forward look. So, energy technology can shift gravity towards China, pulling countries into its orbit. If Beijing leads in clean energy hardware, U.S. warnings about dependence may ring hollow, given Washington's own record of weaponizing networks. That's why the authors argue the U.S. must rebuild and professionalize its economic security machinery, growing expertise, setting clearer rules on when not to use these weapons, and restoring predictability. rules-bound behavior that reassures partners. So the big takeaway is we're past the one-way street of U.S. leverage. The world's key nodes are now contested terrain, and everyone is learning to press and protect choke points. Survival in this era hinges on competence, deep expertise, resilient institutions, and credible limits on coercion that keep allies on side and firms out of the line of fire. Without that, even flagship U.S. networks, from banks to big tech, risk getting caught in the crossfire. So, that being said, if this kind of resonated with you, go ahead and read the essay yourself. Again, it is in the September-October issue of Foreign Affairs. And a little bit about the authors is Henry Farrell is a Stavros Foundation Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. Abram Newman is a John Powers Chair in International Business Diplomacy at the School of Foreign Service and a professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. I always like to read the titles because sometimes they're rather comically long for some reason. But anyways, that's a little bit about those two authors, just kind of like knowing your source, and also it's a foreign affairs magazine. So again, know your source. That's why I kind of say they're summaries of the articles and not much else. It's just kind of to get another point of view. This one tending to be more mainstream. Do keep in mind that this magazine itself is published by the Council of Foreign Relations, kind of like the, godfather in that sense. But anyways, I'm going to leave this one here, and I will see you guys on the next one.